Welcome to Health Systems CIO's interview with Erik Decker, VP and CISO at Intermountain Healthcare, and Shawn Anderson, Director of Endpoint, Data, and Application Security, also with Intermountain. I'm Anthony Guerra, Founder and Editor-in-Chief. Erik and Shawn, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Anthony.
All right, very good. Let's jump right in. Let's start with the usual. Tell me a little bit about your organization and your role. Erik, let's start with you.
Sure. So Intermountain Health, we're an integrated delivery network located in the Mountain West region. We have about 7 states, headquartered in Salt Lake City, about 70,000 employees, 16 billion in revenue, 34 hospitals, and a health plan that covers 1 million lives. That's what makes up the integrated delivery network. So we've got a pretty broad expanse. We believe in value-based care as the model, the healthcare model, meaning that if the best care comes from preventative wellness and so forth, and the whole capitated model around population health and keeping people out of the hospital as much as we possibly can, and of course when acute and chronic issues arise, doing so, caring for those people. So that's pretty much who we are. I'm the CISO for Intermountain, so I head up our cybersecurity program. Have a great organization, 150 caregivers on my team. Shawn is one of them, and we have been at this for quite some time.
All right, Erik, very good. Shawn, you want to tell us a little bit about your role?
Yeah, so my role is the director of the Endpoint Data and Application Protection team. It's a new team that started about 2 months ago now, in an attempt to consolidate some functions that were spread across the organization to reduce friction. Part of my responsibility is, pertains to this conversation around privileged access workstations and that sort of a thing. Yeah, just trying to actually learn my new role. I've been with Intermountain for about 10 years, almost 11, all of it in security. Started my IT career in 2000, trying to remember that far back, just doing a broad range of things.
Erik, we've seen recently quite a few incidents. We have the Change Healthcare incident, Ascensions had a breach. I've heard you speak at conferences and you talk about sort of structural problems in the way health systems and hospitals are architected. And I'm sure I'm going to be using some of the wrong words, but there's an issue, there's an inherent vulnerability in the way things are set up that sort of put the defenders in a bad position, just sort of right from the get-go, and that things can be done differently and should be done differently, but it's a big project and it takes a lot of work. So you want to start off by telling me about sort of, and I've heard you say this before, and I always enjoy listening to it, sort of the typical attack patterns. You say the same things kind of are happening over and over again. There's a paradigm of what they're doing. And then if you want to go into some of these structural problems that again put health systems sort of at a disadvantage from the start.
Yeah, you bet. So we've talked a lot about the threat actor and the threat actor being sophisticated, which is true in the sense of how they have built up their infrastructure, their capability, their playbooks, and scaled their operations. I think what's really important to consider when you're defending an organization is understanding in the broad scope who are the people that would have an interest in coming after your organization. Why would they do that? What's their motivation, and what's the methods and means by which they conduct it? So in general, when we talk about healthcare and you're talking about cybersecurity, everybody immediately goes to ransomware because that is the big hit for the last several years now. Is highly damaging, highly disruptive, causing a lot of problems, and very, very risky and very real. So it's a legit reason to go to ransomware. People also think about stuff like data theft and exfiltration and sale and all of that too. So, first and foremost, who are the threat actors that are interested in causing that kind of attack? Typically organized crime is the answer to that. And there are nation states, don't get me wrong, that will step in. There are nation states that are interested in disruption, but their motivation for disruption is different from organized crime's motivation. Organized crime is making money. Like that's their goal. It's financial. And so as fast and as quickly, that's the same thing. It's fast and it's the whole smash and grab thing, right? Like the more that you can do that, the more money you can make. Like add the volume, expand and expound on that. Dwelling inside of an organization for years is not profitable for organized crime. For nation state actors, different thing entirely. Like they are interested in that. So just let's put that off to the side. So when you look at organized crime, okay, so how do they do it? What are the means and methods that are being applied? We actually studied this in a landscape analysis that the other role that I have is the chairman of the cyber working group of the Health Sector Council. And I partner with Health and Human Services and CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And we did this industry-wide study that showed, what's the resiliency state of the industry look like in healthcare, mostly hospitals, and how are we getting beat? What's the methods by which that's happening? So there was a study that looked at some methods. We looked at some government data. We interviewed about 25 organizations, asked them a bunch of questions. Common themes on all of this, and none of this is revolutionary, by the way. Like everybody already knows this. It's a focus problem, in my opinion, because there's a lot to cover in cyber, and it's very easy to get distracted, and sometimes very easy to lose sight of like the riskiest pathways. So if you think like the adversary, which is really important in this job, you got to think like how the adversary is trying to do what they do in order for you to be able to defend the methods by which they're using. So if you think like the adversary, of course, one of the ways in, my common talk here is 3 ways in and one thing they do once they're in. One of the ways in, of course, is social engineering. No surprise at all. The fish, of course, is one of the ways that the fish to the means of compromising credentials or to the means of dropping malware, inside an environment by having a click, a drive-by malware download. That's a common way in. Another common way in is you have a asset that's on the internet that's vulnerable. And that vulnerability, especially if that vulnerability is a known exploited vulnerability, that is a CISA term, a KEV. Mm-hmm. And that known exploited vulnerability is something that the federal government is tracking. They're tracking how these vulnerabilities are being used, exploited, et cetera. They get the information from companies that are getting hit, and they can use that, remove the attribution associated to it, and inform the rest of the public about how it's happening. And so there's a list that's publicized on their website. They keep that up to date daily. If there's a KEV, a known exploited vulnerability, and on one of your assets, and it's on the internet, you better be on that really fast, because if you're not, it's very likely going to be hit, because it's not hard for the bad actors to actually find that stuff. The other part that I put into the vulnerability bucket is misconfiguration. So you fail to do something important like multi-factor authentication, or a cloud-based system that you opened up the container, and made it available to the world without access control. Like those are common mistakes, and it's the breadth of the mistake, that is why it's so key, because it's just exposed to everything, so the attack surface is highly clear. So that's 2 of the 3. The third way is a third party that has been hit, likely with one of those other 2, and then you have a connection with them, and that connection is in some sort of risky state. It could be a VPN connection, it could be maybe they have like a remote access connection into your environment that you don't control, they control, and so those kinds of things. But just because they get in doesn't mean that they can just immediately start deploying ransomware and causing all this damage. Like getting onto an endpoint doesn't allow for that, unless you have a really bad architecture inside your environment. Then it could potentially allow for that. So you got to think, like, so what they get in, they have to find a beachhead, and they have to get to the systems that control your whole environment, your whole IT stack. And in that control, that's the classic, attack path. That's the race to typically the IT person who is managing all of that. They're looking for that person. They grab those credentials, they escalate their privileges up to that domain dominance level. And then once they have the whole keys to the kingdom, it's game over. The typical path now is they find a bunch of data that they can exfiltrate. They package that up, they exfiltrate it, and then they push the ransomware. In the same way that you push and update your patching, you push product systems, et cetera, whatever, to all of your assets, they push ransomware. So that's it. Like, that's the game, when it comes to the ransomware effect. I've been so far batting 1,000 on talking with my own little informal polls. I know a bunch of CISOs in this space across the country, and those who will talk about it privately. I've asked the question, or I've said, let me guess, is it one of these three? And it was this that happened. The specific thing that they go for is Active Directory, because we all use Active Directory, in corporate America. It's just the nature of, if you have Windows, you're using Active Directory. There's just it has to be there. And the default out of the box deployment of Active Directory is very flat, and it can be done in a way that allows for these bad actors to do what they do.
Okay, so yeah, so that's very well said. Active Directory, everyone has Active Directory. Active Directory out of the box is flat, okay? And flat means that from the beachhead to the IT person / obtaining domain dominance is a very easy journey, correct?
It's fairly easy, yes.
So that's the
But
problem.
yeah,
Go ahead.
that's the problem, right? Now, there's a lot of tools. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of tools. Like, you have things like EDR that's out there. EDR is a fantastic tool set, and that's intended to find that bad actor moving inside that environment before they go do the things, or if they're using the same kinds of privileges that the administrators are using, but in a nefarious way, it can help detect that. And so, like, there are tools that will help this whole process. There's massive stack of suite of tools that will do that, and it's actually important, to have those things in play. I like to look at it as, it is obviously a continuum of defenses. To simplify this, I think the way to think about it for this talk is, what do you do to stop the front of the attack, and what do you do to stop the back of the attack? Like, the last thing that the bad actors do before boom happens.
Right. So, there's ways for defense all along the line, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of the beachheads and the three main ways that you said people get in, from the sense that I get, beachheads are going to happen, right? There's too much vulnerability, there's too many openings, there's too many scenarios, too many things. Beachheads are going to happen. So you can't focus just all your efforts on preventing beachheads, right? You have to assume beachheads are going to happen. And now what do we do? Now what do we do to prevent beachheads, to use those war terminologies, from sort of
Yeah.
breaking out and getting, I'm thinking of Normandy,
Yeah.
but
Totally.
from getting a hold, right? And that's really what you're talking about. Or what we're going to talk about today, it's about really the Active Directory flatness,
Yeah.
right? This to you, and I really want to talk more about your evolution of coming to the conclusions that you're going to discuss today.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very interested in the process. Was this an epiphany? Was this like a flash of lightning, or did this happen over time? But sometimes, you see something, you look at something and you say, this doesn't work. Like this, there's got to be another way. So, if you want to talk a little bit about, you know, how that came about, and then describe how to correct this flatness in Active Directory, or your theory on what maybe everybody should be doing. And again, we'll get into that detail if
Yeah.
only certain types of institutions can tackle this. Maybe some others will have to settle for the other tools you mentioned. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and or spectrums of it, right? I mean,
Right.
it's like you can drive yourself into the you can get really detailed about this really quickly. So, it wasn't an epiphany, it was a it's a long-standing career of talking with a bunch of people. There was, one particular, for me, kind of what started my journey was, I think it was maybe 9 years ago, talking to a CISO of a prominent organization that went through one of these issues, and they were telling me about what they were doing to defend against it. And at the time, it was called Red Forest, is the initial version of this Active Directory construct. I hesitate to use the word zero trust because it's got such a negative connotation to it anymore. But the principle of it is you design an architecture inside the system. It's not extra tools. You design an architecture of isolation inside the system that does not allow for the bad actors to follow the paths that I just laid out, from the 3 ways in to the 1 way that they go in. And so that's like kind of what started it. And then it's evolved over the years. And, for me, it was when it kind of clicked again when we were doing the landscape analysis and we were studying, how all of this is occurring. What are they doing when they break in? I think it was actually, there was a talk I went to and they were talking about adversarial mindset. I was like, oh, that is such a good idea. And, and then I just started thinking like, of course, it's got to be adversarial mindset on how we do this. And, sort of applying all these things together, and then, the journey starts. So the challenge is, talk about Active Directory now. We probably should dive into that. Active Directory is a management platform and an authentication platform. It does both things. So most people think of it as like a directory, like I authenticate by connecting to Active Directory and I have usernames and passwords and away you go. But, in order for you to actually connect your systems into it, there's different levels of connectivity. Sometimes it's as simple as, you just point it to the directory and then it does your authentication for you. Other times it's like highly tightly integrated in, to the whole of how the system operates. And then how you control it is, through privileged accounts, domain administrators, those kinds of things. And you might have you'll have secondary accounts and do these things. But when you're doing that from a workstation that you call productivity workstation, so when you're doing the management of the IT work from the same place that you do the management of your productivity, your email, you've just opened up the door to where those bad actors can operate, right? So, or maybe you don't do that, but you're doing productivity on the same computer, and maybe you're great at never clicking a phishing email or any of those kinds of things. But once they get in, they can easily query Active Directory if you allow that to happen, and ask for things like who are in the domain admin groups, or what are all the administrative things. And it'll happily tell you those answers because it's trying to give, it's a platform, to help you manage. And then once you find where the administrators are, then it's just as easy as like, oh, there's the workstation. Let's just pop over there and then, dwell and wait, and away you go. So the principle behind all of this is isolate it in such a way that it's not possible for the bad actor to get in, query the domain, do all those things, to like discover everything, discover who the IT administrator is, move over to that workstation. And there's a number of ways that they can escalate privileges. It could be deploy Mimikatz or Cobalt Strike onto the thing and pull the creds right out of memory, because that's how Windows operates. Or it could be they're just sitting there waiting to open up a LastPass, on the endpoint, and they're just where all the passwords are, and they just sit there and dwell until that opens up, and then boom, they've got their passwords and they move on. It's all the same theme, which is they can get to that workstation because it's accessible. So the goal of this is you isolate up AD, break it up into tiers. Tier 0 is your full domain sort of control, your domain dominance stuff. Tier 1 is where your servers and applications are, and tier 2 is where your workstations are, your productivity suite. And you do not allow. This is gonna for those listening who have their CISSPs. Last time you probably heard Bell LaPadula was doing the CISSP exam. It's a 1973 principle of there's a couple of things here. There's a strong star property, and I forgot the other part of it. Terrible. Anyways, the whole idea is you cannot control up from a tier below to a tier above, and you do not expose the credentials from the tier above down. And if you do that, then it's not possible for those bad actors to ride the path that is the common path to ride. The game that we're playing, it's a horrible game, but the game that we're playing is we want to break the methods that the bad actors are using at scale. If you break the method, then now they have to deploy and invest a lot more in order to do what they're going to do, which they still might do. Don't get me wrong. Like, it's not a panacea. But you are making it more expensive for them to do what they're trying to do, which is absolutely what we're trying to do. They're never going to stop crime from happening. Like, as much as we want to never have crime in the world, there's always going to be crime in the world. There's always going to be the intention of crime in the world. So we have to make it really expensive for them to do that crime. That is the goal. So close down the common pathway that they're using, that they're writing. That's the whole principle. And then Shawn can talk about, like, how does this work? Like, how do you do it? Like, how do you lock up the tiers? And then how do you even control it then? Like, if you locked it up, then how do you actually run your business?
Yeah, so Shawn, why don't we bring you in here? And obviously you could probably do like a 2-hour explanation of this. But I think let's just frame it up and say, for someone who is obviously very well versed in this stuff, and who's going to understand a lot of what you're going to say, what would you say? What advice would you give? So that's who you're talking to. Are you talking to somebody who gets this stuff, understands a lot of the concepts you're going to describe, but isn't familiar with how to move forward in this particular path or with this strategy? Give them sort of the 5-minute overview of, here's what you need to think about. These are the things you want to consider. These are the things you may not want to do that perhaps might be a gut instinct to go forward this way. No, you don't want to do that because we learned that lesson. So just sort of, I think that helps, like a 5-minute primer for someone who's pretty well versed in this stuff.
Sure. So even though on its face it sounds really simple, no control up, no exposure down, but once you start doing your threat model around that and trying to understand what those paths are, once they get past the breachhead. So part of the principle here is assume breach. And it's a core part of zero trust. I'm not as afraid of zero trust as saying those words as Erik is. Assume breach and no implicit trust, right? So that's where we get into this model where we have to assume that somebody's on the network that has access to your productivity machines, because more than likely they do. More than likely in your environment, you probably have privileged IT people that have access to that same workstation and have authenticated there before. So their credentials are on that workstation that you didn't think you cared about because it was, a frontline employee worker who doesn't have privileged access to things. But now there's an account there with a hash that the attacker can go after. And now they have at least your support person's role. And as Erik said, you use kind of native Active Directory tools, native Windows tools to say, gee, this person also authenticated to these other 500 workstations. Which one of those looks privileged? And you eventually get to a domain controller with that model. So so as part of the threat model, you have to assume that the path that attacker is following looks like an allowed path. They're not adding a new workstation to your network that is running, 50 different malware analysis tools, or they're not launching a Kali Linux desktop in your environment to go and attack something. From your logs, from your EDR perspective, a lot of this sure does look like legitimate traffic because it's a legitimate user, it's a legitimate workstation, it's joined to the domain, it's doing things that a normal computer would do against the domain. And then by the time you discover it, it's when the malware bomb goes off or whatever that is, and you've already lost control of your domain controller, and they've removed permissions from your domain admins, or they've embedded themselves differently. So one thing I would recommend here is don't focus on your perimeter controls. Don't focus on the idea that, well, yeah, but my people wouldn't do that, or yeah, but I have anti-malware on my workstation, so that malware can't launch, because that's not where it's starting. It's starting after it's changed its permissions. So you kind of have to start changing the way you think about this from a perimeter mindset, from a network mindset, from a quote trusted user mindset, and just assume that something bad is happening. And what you want to do is break the chain as early as possible. And the way you do that is by implementing an architecture that simply doesn't allow for that first privilege escalation to really occur. So you break the ability for a domain admin to log on to a productivity workstation. That's one of your core concepts for making sure that you don't expose credentials down. So you create policies or whatever you have to make sure that that never happens. On the flip side, you create policies and implement things so that a productivity user nor a productivity workstation ever has the ability to do any type of privileged authentication to your domain controller. And once you get into the details of that, it actually gets really complicated. It's super easy to say, but I would just, people that are looking at this, think about it that way. Don't focus so much on things like network segmentation. Yes, that's a good thing. Don't focus so much on EDR. Yes, that's an important part of this whole thing. But at the very core, just realize that until the bomb goes off, the traffic looks legitimate. Your logging tools are going to assume that everything is just fine, because the attacker is intentionally making it look like normal traffic that occurs within your network, or the footprint is so small that being able to find the deviation is just incredibly challenging. And it's kind of a losing battle to try and follow them along the path, because you're always going to be a step behind by the time you get to them.
How important an element is this idea of physical workstations being only for one type of user? So like a machine, right? You don't want machines being used by both what you call productivity workers, which is someone without escalated privileges, and someone with escalated privileges. Correct? You don't want those two individuals using the same machine ever. Is that correct?
I would focus a little bit less on the individual for that question, because an individual both has productivity. They need to check email, they need to get on Zoom meetings, team meetings, whatever that is. They need to search the internet for stuff, but they also have a role where they need to do privileged functions
Mm-hmm.
against very highly privileged resources. So it's not so much that you don't want the same people doing both of those things, because that's not possible, right? Like we all have to do email. What you want to do is separate out the access, so that that individual can only use a privileged account from a privileged computer to do
Yeah.
privileged activities, and they only do their email, their internet searching, et cetera, from a workstation that falls into that tier 2 productivity layer, and you break the connection. And what we talk about is using a clean keyboard.
Yeah.
From the privilege side, it has to start with the clean keyboard, because that's the system that you've verified has all the controls in place, that's locked down, that's isolated correctly from the point that the individual puts hands on the keyboard. And they're going to use a completely different account that's privileged completely differently to do that kind of stuff. Separate keyboard for email.
So if you're at a higher access where, or an IT or a domain controller, if you're someone with with higher access, you would have to go to two different machines to do your work. You from one machine you're doing your privileged work, and you're certainly not logging into your email from that same machine. You're going to a different physical machine to do that. So that's one of the principles here, correct? And nobody is popping on to the machine where the privileged user has been working to log in and do their email, right? Those things separate.
Correct. And that's where you put controls in place, so it's not a user behavior control. You don't give the privileged user that's using the privileged workstation the ability to do any of that. They can't
Right,
circumvent your control
right.
and go, oh, well, I'm just going to check my email real quick because I have a log file that I need access to, right? You've got to put the protection mechanisms around it, because you can't rely on user behavior. Even though these are highly trusted individuals, um, you're going to break the model if you just rely on the user to decide whether or not they're going to do it.
Is there an area here where physical security and cybersecurity really sort of come together, meaning these machines that are only to be used for privileged work, are they somehow better protected, or they're only in the office, meaning you can't do this kind of work remotely, or can you? Can you do this kind of work remotely on a laptop? So are there any restrictions there, or any thoughts where physical meets cyber?
Yeah, so there is, from our perspective, there's no hard requirement that the device be physically located in a physically secure data center, and you have to drive in and touch the keyboard there. That's not the world we live in from a worker perspective. We have administrators that don't live anywhere near a data center. There's a lot of remote work going on, so you can't build a model that requires that. I guess unless you're the DoD and you have
Yeah, I was gonna
people
say,
going into a
unless you're
special room
popping
at the
into
Pentagon.
if you're going into a skiff, that's a different
Right,
story. But
right,
yeah.
yeah. But in our
Yeah.
environment, we don't have that.
Yeah.
So what you do is, you don't focus so much on the physical security that surrounds the computer. You take that security and that isolation down to the computer. Obviously, if an attacker gets a hold of a workstation, once you have physical access, you can do a whole bunch of stuff to that workstation. But you have to have controls along the way that are validating that that laptop still meets the security requirement that you have in place for compliance checks. You have checks to make sure that that user is behaving in a way that is expected for that privileged user. Even if an attacker gets a hold of, a privileged access workstation, if it's controlled correctly, the damage they can do from there should actually be pretty limited, because they can't go get more malware. For example, you can't go download a malware package without spending a lot of time compromising the local workstation. And hopefully by that point, someone says, hey, I lost my workstation, and you can deprovision it. This is all, a lot of this is going to be based on cloud device management types of technologies. So you always have the ability to shut down that device at a moment's notice, in the case that there's a physical breach of some kind to the system.
One other thing to just add to this. So again, as I said, no system is 100% foolproof. So it is possible to break the path. But as Shawn said, it's going to take them longer, and hopefully you'll detect it. So with this whole strategy has to come a detection and response playbook as well. Like, what are the paws that you have? What are the privileged accounts? How are you monitoring that? Also, just another principle here, the binding of those two things, the privileged account to the device is the magic sauce. It's not just the privileged account, which most people think about, in the control of their identity space is controlling the account. there's that. There are other model. I mean, it doesn't always have to be a physical device, although that's the most secure way to do it. You know, if you had to, like, once you start talking about the other tiers, like tier one, you break up tier one into sub tiers, you know, based on like server classes. You manage all of that exactly the same, but every tier needs a pod. So like suddenly you're talking about potentially 5, 6, 7 workstations, and you can imagine the level of pain that would entail. So you can virtualize this stuff, but I would also immediately people are going to think, oh, I've got a jump box, so jump box is going to work. No, because if you've got a jump box, the bad actor has a jump box. You got to think about it in those terms. And you also have to control the other piece to this. Maybe Shawn can talk about this a little bit more, is there's the management of the tier. Let's just talk tier 0, domain dominance, domain admin equivalent. There's the management of that. You have systems that actually manage those tiers. And so it's not just the pause the pause are how you get in and do the work, but everything that is, if it's going to touch tier 0, it has to be tier 0, which means the way you work on tier 0 systems is going to change. The other piece I tell folks is you're going to go through the 7 stages of grief. The IT people, you're going to go through it. You're going to first like believe that you can deny your way out of it, and then you're going to get mad because you're not going to be able to do the work the way you did your work before, and everything's going to feel like it's going to be slower, and productivity is going to go down. Then you're going to try to negotiate your way through, like, well, I just need this one thing. But every time you allow a negotiation like that to happen, you open it up to the bad actor as well. So you've just got to be really, really like true to the model, because where it breaks is where you break the model in order to allow for your business to, you know, operate in a way. But Shawn, maybe you want to talk about the different types of pause that you can do?
Yeah, so I think a really important part of this is that it has to start with a clean keyboard, and you'll hear Erik and I, when we talk about these things, say that constantly. So when you talk about a jump box, that connection didn't start from a clean keyboard. Most likely it started from the same workstation that you do your email on. So like Erik said, now you have a path. So if you're talking about not having to run, you know, carry around a box full of laptops all the time, if you start with a clean keyboard and you do, you know, a type 1 hypervisor, whatever that is in your environment, you can then create virtualized pause and virtualized productivity workstations on top of that hypervisor. It's really important, though, that it is a type 1 hypervisor rather than a type 2, because you want the hypervisor to be the thing that's controlling your hardware directly, and not use something like VirtualBox sitting on top of an OS that probably isn't a clean keyboard, right? So that's a method that you can use if in your environment you do have administrators that may cross tiers, which is very, very likely that you'll have someone that may be a domain admin that also has some accountability for some other type of a service that's associated with domain access or something like that maybe doesn't rise to the level of tier 0 because of what it does. I also want to maybe expand or a little bit on something Erik said, that if it touches tier 0, it's tier 0. This is a conversation that's created a lot of consternation, and at least with our teams, that touch doesn't mean read from. Touch in this context means control. So you can imagine AD has to be read by everything in the environment. So then the question we get is, well, does everything have to be tier 0 then? And doesn't that break the model? And the answer is no, because you don't have to read credentials from the domain controller from every device in the environment. You don't have to control Active Directory or the domain controller from every device in the environment. So it's really important to have your philosophy kind of dialed down in the words you want to use with your teams, so that they don't think that what you're telling them is now everything that they do has to be done from a privileged access workstation that doesn't allow them to do anything. That's also part of the conversation, is to be really clear that you do these these 3 functions a couple of times a month or maybe a couple of times a week. These are the things you use your privileged access workstation for. The rest of all the stuff that you do doesn't require that. So yes, you can't seamlessly go from email to control, but 98% of what you do is not done on the pod. So all of these restrictions and scary things that you're thinking about aren't really going to affect your daily job because most of that doesn't occur from the pod. It's highly unlikely you have an administrator that sits all day long at a domain controller console doing stuff. We have a really robust Active Directory environment, and our domain controllers most of the time don't use their pods for their work, or domain
All
admins
right.
rather.
Very, very good. Erik, if I'm a CISO and I'm listening to this and I'm saying, well, this sounds really interesting, but it sounds like a big project and it sounds like there's some trade-offs. There's some expense got to go in here, a lot of work. There's some slowdown in productivity, perhaps, that if you don't accept that, if you fight against that, you're going to compromise the model. And like, what's the whole point at that point? So, but obviously this is something that you believe in. Why do you think, or what would your argument be to say this is worth the work?
So, I mean, first is talking about the threat, going again back to that adversarial mindset and how is this happening? So getting buy-in to doing this, because you are talking about retrofitting an environment. I mean, that's the unfortunate space. Now, if you're a CISO that's just starting with a new company, congratulations, build it this way as you start. Build it in now because it's going to be way cheaper and easier to do it applied in that way. The other thing I would say is, you can attach these to like bigger initiatives. Maybe there's like, I don't know, if you're going through like a big M&A thing or something along those lines, you can use that as an opportunity when there's the organization's already primed for change to say, this is a time that we need to capitalize on that change. If you're not in that space and instead you're just at a high risk, situation, or high risk industry, due to ransomware, I mean, just look at what the damage of ransomware is. And you can use that as an impetus into doing so. But in all of this, leverage your governance processes, talk about the risk as it is, don't sell it as a silver bullet, sell it as this is going to slow them down significantly. It is a big step in doing it if you do it right. And you get that buy-in, to get going and then get started. It's going to take time. First of all, I'll just say that too. Like, this is not a overnight kind of deal. It's also not you go buy a technology and slap it in and suddenly it's all done. Like, you're literally redesigning how your systems are communicating, to one another inside your environment. So that you got to get buy-in from lots of people in order to move that along. Some of the most important people are actually your infrastructure, operations, applications people, because you got to even when starting this off, you need to over communicate what's going to happen, what the experience is going to be like, and give them time to come through to the fruition. So if you kick a project like this off, talk about what's going to occur, you can give a schedule, fantastic, and just prime them and keep priming them. Pardon me. Because when that moment of change happens, that's when it's real, as far as like what had occurred. So I think those are my suggestions. Microsoft actually has some, like I said, it used to be called Red Forest. They depreciated that. Then they called it Enhanced Security Admin Environment. Then they depreciated that. And now I don't know if I think it's called this. I think it's called Ramp, Rapid. Hold on, I had it over here just a second ago. Rapid Modernization Plan. And it's a privileged access strategy and rapid modernization plan. If you click on that, go to Microsoft's site, you'll see that this is sort of like the next stage post enhanced security admin environment. Read up on this and like get deep into what Microsoft is talking about as it relates to this, because I think that's going to give you a lot of resources as well on how to start thinking through it.
So this is something that Microsoft understands, has
Yeah.
embraced. This is not something you call at Microsoft and they say, tell me again, we don't know what you're
No.
talking about. So this is something they've got the model for. So you're not starting from zero.
Yep.
You're starting, you can go to Microsoft and say, we want to do this. And then they'll say, okay, you ready? Because it's a big deal, right? They're going to say, are you ready?
Yeah. You can go to Microsoft if you want a service contract with them. They're happy to step you through it.
Or you could do it outside of them. Is that what you're saying?
You
don't
could. I
necessarily
mean,
need to
again,
have,
like
yeah.
I'm sure there are others that understand. Like I said, we didn't invent this. This is just this is an application of principles that have already been out there. It's just not been well adopted. If you're going to go for services outside of Microsoft, then I would just make sure that you do it with somebody who's doing it right, and not somebody who thinks that they know how they're doing it and is giving you bad advice. Like because like Shawn was saying, when you get deep into it, you're going to start talking about this or that. And you need to be able to bench that against, does this break Bell Lapidula or does it not?
Is this your advice or your recommendation that do you have to be of a certain size? And again, we're talking about health systems. So is this for
Right.
everyone? Are you saying every person who's running security at your hospital or health system, you must think about this, you must move in this direction?
Must is a strong word.
You should. Could you say, if you don't consider this, if you don't fully think about this, if you're not bringing this to people that can make this decision as your recommendation, you are not doing your job properly. This is the true north. No, we're not saying that.
I'm not going to say that.
Okay, what are we saying? What are we saying?
What we're saying is, because that kind of statement is saying that you're not doing your due diligence unless you do this, and that's not true. This is all grades of resources and capability at the end of the day, and you can be a small organization that has the resources and capability to do this and do it well. It's not even necessarily a size thing, and you can also do elements of this and actually do a really good job of enhancing your security posture that will do things to slow down the bad actor. Even if you walk away from this talk and you say, where are all my privileged accounts? And wait, are my like regular people using like admin privileges on their regular accounts? And then you start wiping that away, you're doing a good thing. So you're on the right step to slowing down how these actors are doing what they do. It's so think of this as like the kind of the penultimate design of hopefully that's not too strong of a statement of trying to stop this kind of activity from occurring. So it just depends, and it's going to be very hard if you're big and complicated. It's going to be very hard to implement it that way because of just how big and complicated it all is. Like Active Directory is everywhere in your environment, and you're talking about retrofitting it, and so that means this priority has to be at the same level as the other major business priorities in order for that to work. So there's a lot of executive sponsorship that has to happen there.
Go ahead, Shawn.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd just add on to that a lot of this is going to depend on an organization's risk model that they have internally, what their risk tolerance is, and so if this fits, if this is something that helps close gaps within the risk model, it's certainly worthwhile to do. I would also say that it's as Erik mentioned right at the top, it's not the panacea. This does not prevent data loss. This does not prevent breaches of your EMR potentially or your imaging system. Those are not systems that, at least in a model, typically would fall into tier 0, because those aren't the systems that equal domain dominance. So I think you have to be really careful about how one talks about this. That this specifically, from a tier 0 perspective, if we stay at that highest level, the goal here is to prevent domain dominance. Like that's it. And the privilege escalation path to that. So if you get, and we've gotten hung up on this internally, if you get hung up on the idea of saying, yeah, but our EHR data, that can get lost. Yes, it can. This is to control the outcome of having to rebuild your entire management structure. So if you think about the risk and getting pushback around the changes to business processes, if this goes bad, if the attacker gets what they need to, the only recourse is to completely rebuild your entire Active Directory environment from the ground up. That is business disruptive. That is really expensive. And that's what organizations are having to do to recover from these types of attacks.
That's why it takes 60 days or longer for companies to come back up.
Erik, the workflow disruption, is that mostly for those with privileged access, or is it everybody?
No,
The
this
workflow change.
this really is IT people that it disrupts.
Okay.
You're not even
Okay.
talking about the regular users. Yeah.
Okay, they don't feel this.
They don't even know. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess it's a little easier then, because the people you're disrupting are your own people, and they certainly understand the threat. It's not that you have to be out there doing a lot of education about the threat to justify the disruption.
Yeah, I would again just reiterate adversarial mindset and the way, as Shawn is saying, the communication of the why, because it's easy to lose the why in all of this and only look at everything just changed. And to rally against it, right? I mean, it's so easy to do that, but when you explain it, like, we don't want to have to rebuild this whole thing if it all starts all over again. And, like, you think it's painful now, wait till then. It's easier to palate it.
All right, I think we covered most of it. Is final piece of advice, anything you want to add? Shawn, I'm going to start with you. Again, keep in mind that individual in your position at another health system who perhaps their Erik Decker or their boss said, "Hey, this sounds good. Let's go do this." What's your best piece of advice? Maybe a getting started piece of advice.
Getting started, look at your threat model. Try to plan a path with an adversarial mindset where you get from an email, social engineering attack, a website click, to a domain controller admin account or a domain admin account. What does that look like? And then you start looking at the tools you have in place that can either stop or detect those types of things. And then make sure that you bring in as many different types of stakeholders as you can really early on, because you're going to have the conversation with these people 10, 15 times to get everybody's heads wrapped around it. I'm not just saying operations, like cyber people, when we've had internal conversations about this, it's taken some work to get everybody to think in this way and not think about things in terms of firewalls, right? So plan an adequate amount of runway to get everybody on board, to get everybody comfortable. And then at some point, assume that you're going to pull the trigger. Don't delay because one person has a concern. At some point, you just have to make the decision to go, and it's going to hurt. When we hit go, it hurt.
You were not popular.
No, I am not popular right now. But we're fixing problems, right? Like that's the message, is we're not going to change the model because we encountered a problem. We're going to fix the problem within the construct of the model.
Erik, your final piece of advice, it sounds like something interesting here that I think you mentioned is you can do this slowly. You could do it in smaller pieces. This does not mean everything you're doing, because sometimes people feel overwhelmed, right? So you could have a CISO saying, I'm working, 100 hours a week. I'm stressed out all the time. We have no extra money and I need 5 people, right? And you're talking about a giant project. What would you say to that person to allay that sort of initial panic at contemplating this? Is, again, that sort of perhaps smaller bites way, meaning you don't have to give up 100% of what you're working on. Maybe make 10% room and start. Is that?
Yeah. So what I would say is, you need to first figure out, like, what are you capable of doing inside your organization? And that capability, actually, a massive part of that is the people side of it. Like, what are your people capable of doing? And because even if you bring in services organizations to help you out, you have to run it.
Yeah.
Like they're going to go away, and the people that are running this have to understand like what's going on. So so I think there's that. I mean, I would honestly start with just educating yourself about what all of this is, and get talk to other people who have been on the path and get a sense of it. Start there. You could, I mean, today anybody and everybody should be looking at stuff like, what's your primary account admin levels look like. There shouldn't, hopefully keep that as minimal as possible. Look at how your IT people are actually managing assets in your environment. Like, are they using their primary accounts for that or not? Like you can move that stuff off to secondary accounts, and even if they're doing it from their productivity computers, take a much better step in security. In fact, in some cases, if you want cyber insurance, you better be doing it, because like that's an expectation that be the case. So like I said, that's like the 10% thing, start by stripping out. Don't have admins running like people as regular admins on their endpoints, on their productivity computers across the board, because that's opening the door up. That beachhead just became a lot easier, to expand, like once if you do that. So those are the identity side of the house of which you can start with and pulling it back. This is all about the identity and the device, and then and the control, as Shawn was saying. So if you want to go full bore into this, then definitely read up on Ramp. Reach out to Microsoft if you have the budget and ability to do that. I would also say some of your key partners in this, you can get executive sponsorship, and that's fine, but you got to get your run partners on board. You got to get your CTO or your head of infrastructure on board. Also, depending upon who owns Active Directory, if it's not cyber that owns it, then, and it's your CTO that owns it, they really have to be on board because it's their resources that are going to be in the middle of the whole thing, and they got to be bought in, to doing that. So you got to have those partners. Of course, get your CIO or CDIO, in agreement with. It's a good step forward, and lay out like what the journey is going to look like and what the costs are going to look like and what the intended outcome is going to be. Like, why would we do this? Like, what's it going to do? The last thing I would say is when you're done, pen test it, because you need to check that, as Shawn was saying, there's a lot of control paths in here. There's a lot of things that are going to, when you get into the details, it's going to get messy. So you need to double check that those things are all actually operating as intended, and do that continually. Don't just do it once and walk away and assume that it's all done. The thing about technology is it changes all the time, and all of this changes all the time, because there's needs that change. So you have to reaffirm that it's still in place. So it's a worthy, even just doing a pen test and say with an outside firm, get to domain dominance. Even if you don't do any of this and you pen test and say, get to domain dominance, very valuable, because they're going to show you the path that they took to get there. And that's the exact same path that the bad actors are going to follow, So ideally, if you do this, they're not going to be able to get there. Like, that's the point, and then you can prove it out and so forth. So,
yeah. You get to the point where the pen test fails and they say we couldn't. That's that would be nice, right? That would be a very nice result.
Right.
Awesome discussion, guys. I think this is going to be so valuable to people. Get them thinking in the right direction. Give them some advice on how to move forward if they wish. Shawn, Erik, amazing. Thank you guys so much for sharing.
You bet. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.